The church was heavy with grief, the air thick with lilies and the low murmur of mourners as sunlight filtered through stained glass and painted the pews in fractured color. I stood by my wife's casket, my hands trembling, my heart raw, surrounded by friends and family who had come to pay their respects. My son, Ethan, was at the front, his face a mask of anger and impatience, his new wife whispering in his ear. I tried to focus on the eulogy, on the memories of a life built together, but I could feel Ethan's eyes burning into me, his resentment simmering just beneath the surface. As the final hymn faded and the pastor offered a prayer, Ethan suddenly stood, his voice slicing through the silence like a blade. "Enough of this," he shouted, his words echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Hand over Mom's $65 million, right now." The room froze, every head turning, every breath held. My sister gasped, my brother-in-law's jaw dropped, and even the pastor looked stunned. Ethan pointed at me, his face twisted with entitlement and rage. "You know it's mine. You know she wanted me to have it. Don't make me fight you in front of everyone." The whispers started, a ripple of shock and disbelief. My wife's best friend clutched her pearls, my daughter Emily buried her face in her hands, and Ethan's wife smirked, her eyes cold and triumphant. I felt the humiliation burn through me, the pain of loss now joined by the sting of public betrayal. But I just smiled, my expression calm, and walked out without a word, the doors closing behind me with a finality that silenced the room. If you enjoy powerful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Outside, the sunlight was blinding, the world suddenly too bright, too real. I took a deep breath, pulled out my phone, and dialed my lawyer. "Carter, it's time," I said, my voice steady. "Let's put the plan in motion." That's when the real game began. As I walked to my car, I could hear the commotion inside, the raised voices, the confusion, the first cracks in Ethan's carefully constructed world. I knew the tables had turned in an instant, and that my son, so sure of his victory, had no idea what was coming next. The inheritance was never just about money. It was about respect, about legacy, about the lessons my wife and I had tried to teach him. And now, as I drove away from the church, I promised myself that I would protect her wishes, my dignity, and the future of our family, no matter what it cost. The days after the funeral were a blur of headlines, phone calls, and the kind of silence that settles in a house when grief and anger have both overstayed their welcome. Ethan's outburst had become the talk of the town. Neighbors whispered about it at the grocery store, old friends called to offer sympathy or, more often, to ask what I would do next. My phone buzzed with messages from relatives, some urging me to just give him the money and keep the peace, others telling me to stand my ground and honor your wife's wishes. I spent my nights in the study, surrounded by the scent of her perfume and the echo of her laughter, reading and rereading the will she'd left behind. My wife had been meticulous, her love for Ethan matched only by her fear of what entitlement could do to a man's soul. The will was clear, the $65 million would be managed by me until Ethan proved he was ready. But readiness, in her eyes, was not about age or blood, it was about character. The conditions were strict. Ethan would inherit only if he completed a year of community service, passed a financial literacy course, and reconciled with his estranged sister, Emily. If he failed, the money would go to charity. I met with Carter, my lawyer, in his office downtown, the city's noise muffled by thick carpets and the weight of secrets. "He's going to fight this," Carter said, flipping through the documents. "But the will is airtight. Your wife thought of everything." I nodded, my heart heavy. "She always did." Carter smiled, a rare warmth in his eyes. "You did the right thing, Franklin. This isn't about revenge. It's about respect." As we finalized the legal filings, Ethan's campaign grew more aggressive. He showed up at my house, shouting on the lawn, demanding his birthright. I refused to engage, letting Carter handle every message, every threat. The more Ethan pushed, the more the community began to see his true colors. Old friends reached out in support, while Ethan's reputation began to crumble. The local paper ran a story, "Family Fortune Feud, Son Demands Inheritance at Mother's Funeral," and suddenly, the world was watching. I felt the pressure mounting, the weight of legacy and love pressing down on me. But I also felt a strange sense of peace. My wife had trusted me to protect her wishes, and I would not let her down. As the sun set over the city, I sat on the porch, the will in my lap, and made a promise to myself, I would see this through, no matter the cost. The real battle was just beginning, and I was ready to fight for the dignity of my family, and for the son I still hoped to save. The days that followed were a storm of public spectacle and private pain. Ethan, furious that I wouldn't cave, took his campaign to the internet, posting a video on social media that quickly went viral. In it, he stood in front of my house, his voice trembling with righteous anger as he accused me of stealing his future and betraying his mother's last wishes. The comments poured in, some siding with him, others calling out his entitlement, but all of them fueling the fire. The local news picked up the story, and soon I was fielding calls from reporters, neighbors, and even distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years. My lawyer, Carter, advised me to stay silent, to let the will and the court speak for themselves. "Don't give him the satisfaction of a public fight," he said. "The more noise he makes, the more people will see who he really is." But the pressure was relentless. I couldn't go to the grocery store without someone stopping me to ask about the money, the will, the feud. Old friends offered support, but I could see the questions in their eyes. Was I being too harsh? Was I letting pride get in the way of family? At night, I sat in my study, the house too quiet, the weight of my wife's absence pressing down on me. I reread her will, her careful handwriting spelling out the conditions she'd set for Ethan, a year of community service, a financial literacy course, and reconciliation with Emily. I thought of Emily, my daughter, who had left home years ago after a fight with Ethan, her letters growing less frequent until they stopped altogether. The pain of that loss was a wound that never quite healed. I wondered if this battle would drive her further away, or if it might finally bring her home. The first court date arrived, the courthouse packed with reporters and curious onlookers. Ethan's lawyer tried to paint me as a manipulator, a bitter old man clinging to power. But Carter was ready. He presented the will, the conditions, the evidence of Ethan's behavior. The judge listened, her face unreadable, but I saw the flicker of understanding in her eyes. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "your wife's wishes are clear. The conditions stand. Ethan exploded in court, shouting that he would never stoop to charity work or beg Emily for forgiveness. The judge's patience wore thin. "Then you forfeit the inheritance," she said simply. The room erupted in whispers, Ethan's face a mask of disbelief and rage. As I left the courthouse, the cameras flashing, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief. The public battle had exposed the truth, but it had also left scars. I wondered if Ethan would ever understand, if he would ever forgive me, or himself. That night, as I sat on the porch, the city lights twinkling in the distance, I made a silent promise to my wife's memory. I would protect her legacy, no matter the cost. The real test was still to come, and I was ready to face it, alone, if I had to. The days after the first court hearing were a blur of headlines, awkward encounters, and sleepless nights. Franklin found himself haunted by the echo of Ethan's rage, the way his son's voice had cracked in the courtroom, the look of betrayal in his eyes. The house felt emptier than ever, the silence broken only by the occasional ring of the phone, reporters, lawyers, distant relatives all wanting a piece of the story. Franklin tried to focus on the farm, on the routines that had always grounded him, but even the land seemed restless, the fields waiting for rain that wouldn't come. Then, one morning, as he sorted through the mail, he found a letter addressed in a familiar, looping script. Emily. His hands shook as he opened it, the paper soft and worn from travel. "Dad, I saw the news. I'm sorry it's come to this. I know things between Ethan and me have been broken for a long time, but I never wanted it to end like this. I'm coming home. I want to help, if you'll have me." Franklin sat at the kitchen table, the letter pressed to his chest, tears stinging his eyes. He remembered the last time he'd seen Emily, her face flushed with anger, her voice trembling as she told Ethan she was done, that she couldn't watch him destroy himself or the family any longer. She'd left that night, and for years, her absence had been a wound that never quite healed. Now, the hope of her return was a balm, a chance to mend what had been broken. That evening, Franklin called Carter and told him about the letter. "If Emily comes back, it could change everything," Carter said. "The judge will see that the family is trying to heal. It might even push Ethan to reconsider." Franklin nodded, hope and fear warring in his chest. The next day, Emily arrived, her hair shorter, her eyes older, but her smile as warm as ever. She hugged Franklin tightly, her voice thick with emotion. "I missed you, Dad." They sat on the porch, talking late into the night, about the past, about Ethan, about the pain and the hope that still lingered between them. Emily agreed to testify in court, to tell the truth about what had happened, to give Ethan a chance to make amends. "He's still my brother," she said softly. "I want to believe he can change." As the sun rose over the fields, Franklin felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, his family was together again, if only for a moment. The battle was far from over, but with Emily by his side, Franklin believed they could face whatever came next. The next court date loomed, and with it, the chance for redemption, or for the final, shattering break. As Franklin watched Emily walk through the fields, her laughter mingling with the morning breeze, he made a silent promise. He would fight for his family, for his wife's legacy, and for the hope that forgiveness was still possible. Emily's return sent ripples through the family and the entire community. The news spread quickly. Franklin's estranged daughter was back, and she was willing to testify. The local paper ran a new headline: "Hayes family rift may heal as daughter returns." Franklin felt hope and dread in equal measure as he watched Emily settle back into the rhythms of the farm, her presence a balm to his wounded heart. She and Mark spent long evenings talking on the porch, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying, the years of distance slowly giving way to understanding. But the real test came in the courtroom. On the day of her testimony, the gallery was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Ethan sat at the defendant's table, his face pale, his eyes flickering with a mix of anger and fear. Emily took the stand, her voice steady as she recounted the years of pain, how Ethan's entitlement had driven her away, how their mother's illness had fractured the family, how she'd watched from afar as her brother's greed consumed him. "I left because I couldn't watch him destroy everything our parents built," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "But I never stopped loving my family. I came back because I believe in second chances." The judge listened intently, her expression softening as Emily described the hope she still held for her brother. Then Carter stood, holding a folder. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to introduce new evidence." He handed the judge a series of emails, correspondence between Ethan and a financial advisor, revealing that Ethan had tried to move money out of the estate before the will was even read. The emails were damning, showing a pattern of deception and manipulation that went back years. The courtroom erupted in whispers, Ethan's lawyer scrambling to object, but the judge waved him off. "This evidence is admissible. Mr. Hayes, do you have anything to say?" Ethan's face crumpled, his arrogance finally breaking. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I was scared. I thought if I didn't get the money, I'd lose everything. I didn't know how to stop." The room was silent, the weight of his confession settling over everyone. Franklin felt a surge of sorrow and relief, the pain of betrayal mingling with the hope of redemption. Emily stepped down from the stand, her eyes meeting Ethan's. "It's not too late, Ethan. But you have to choose, family or fortune." The judge called a recess, the tension in the room palpable. As Franklin and Emily left the courthouse, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the city in golden light. Franklin put an arm around his daughter, his heart full. "You saved us, Emily. No matter what happens next, I'm proud of you." That night, as they sat together on the porch, Franklin realized that the real battle was not for money, but for the soul of his family. The revelation had changed everything, and the next step would determine whether they could truly heal, or if the wounds would remain forever. The courthouse was silent as the judge returned from recess, her robe trailing behind her like a shadow as she took her seat. Franklin sat with Emily on one side, Mark on the other, the three of them united for the first time in years. Ethan sat alone, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. The gallery was packed, the air thick with anticipation and the low hum of whispered speculation. The judge cleared her throat, her gaze sweeping the room. "This case is not just about money," she began, her voice steady. "It's about family, about trust, and about the legacy of a woman who wanted her children to earn what she built." She recounted the evidence, Ethan's public outburst, the damning emails, Emily's testimony, and the airtight conditions of the will. "Mr. Hayes," she said, turning to Ethan, "your mother's wishes were clear. You will inherit only if you complete a year of community service, pass a financial literacy course, and reconcile with your sister. If you fail, the money will go to charity." Ethan's face crumpled, his arrogance finally broken. "I understand, Your Honor," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The judge nodded, her expression softening. "You have 1 year. Use it wisely." The room erupted in whispers, some in shock, others in relief. Franklin felt a wave of emotion crash over him, pride, sorrow, hope. He looked at Emily, her eyes shining with tears, and at Mark, whose hand gripped his shoulder in silent support. Ethan stood, his face pale, and turned to his family. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "I know I don't deserve it, but I want to try." Emily stepped forward, her arms open. "We'll help you, Ethan. But you have to do the work." The judge banged her gavel, dismissing the court. As the crowd filed out, Franklin hugged his children, the pain of the past slowly giving way to hope. That night, as they sat together on the porch, the stars bright above, Franklin realized that the real victory was not in the courtroom, but in the chance to rebuild his family. The judge's decision was a turning point, a chance for redemption, for forgiveness, for a new beginning. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Franklin believed they could face it together. The next year would test them all, but he was ready to fight for the legacy his wife had left, and for the family he still hoped to save. The year that followed the judge's decision was the hardest and most transformative of Franklin's life. Ethan, stripped of his arrogance and forced to confront the consequences of his actions, began his community service at a local shelter, his first day marked by awkward silences and the wary glances of people who had read about his outburst in the papers. Franklin watched from a distance, resisting the urge to step in, knowing that his son needed to find his own way. Emily visited often, her presence a steadying force, her forgiveness offered not as a gift but as a challenge, one Ethan would have to earn. Mark, too, found himself drawn back into the family orbit, his own wounds slowly healing as he worked alongside Ethan and Franklin to repair the farm, the house, and the fragile bonds that held them together. The community watched, some skeptical, others hopeful, as Ethan struggled through the months of service, his pride slowly giving way to humility. He attended financial literacy classes, his frustration at first obvious, but over time, he began to ask questions, to listen, to learn. Franklin saw glimpses of the boy he'd once known, the one who had helped him fix fences, who had laughed at his jokes, who had believed in the value of hard work and honesty. But the road was not easy. There were setbacks, nights when Ethan came home angry and defeated, days when old habits threatened to resurface, moments when the pain of the past seemed too great to overcome. Franklin struggled, too, his own patience tested, his faith in the process wavering. He found himself in therapy for the first time, talking through the grief of losing his wife, the guilt of failing his children, the fear that forgiveness might never be enough. Emily was his anchor, her quiet strength a reminder that healing was possible, even when it felt out of reach. As the year wore on, small victories began to accumulate. Ethan made friends at the shelter, his empathy growing as he listened to the stories of people who had lost everything and still found reasons to hope. He passed his financial literacy course, his pride in the certificate tempered by the knowledge of how much he still had to learn. He and Emily began to talk, not just about the past, but about the future, about the possibility of rebuilding trust, of being a family again. Franklin watched it all with a mix of pride and fear, knowing that the real test was not in the courtroom, but in the daily work of forgiveness and change. As the year drew to a close, the family gathered on the porch, the farm bathed in the golden light of a new season. Ethan stood, his voice steady, and apologized again, not just for the outburst at the funeral, but for the years of anger and entitlement that had nearly destroyed them all. Franklin hugged his son, his heart full. "We're not perfect, son. But we're still here. And that's what matters." The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Franklin believed they could face whatever came next, together. The last month of Ethan's year of service arrived with a sense of both hope and dread, the family walking on eggshells as the judge's deadline loomed. Franklin watched his son with a mixture of pride and anxiety, seeing how far Ethan had come but fearing that the past might still have one last card to play. The shelter staff praised Ethan's dedication, and Emily, now a regular volunteer herself, told Franklin that she believed her brother had truly changed. But the community was not so quick to forget. Rumors swirled that Ethan had only done the work for the money, that his apologies were rehearsed, that the judge would never really let him inherit. Franklin tried to shield Ethan from the worst of it, but he knew that the final test would not come from the court, but from the world outside. Then, just days before the final hearing, a crisis erupted. A fire broke out at the shelter, the result of faulty wiring, and Ethan was the first to respond. He helped evacuate the residents, carried an elderly man to safety, and stayed behind to fight the flames until the fire department arrived. The story made the news, and for the first time, the headlines were about Ethan's courage, not his mistakes. But as the smoke cleared, a new challenge emerged. One of the shelter's residents, a troubled young man named Marcus, accused Ethan of stealing from him during the chaos. The accusation spread quickly, and soon the community was divided again, some defending Ethan, others calling for his arrest. Franklin's heart sank as he watched his son face the old doubts and suspicions, his hard-won progress suddenly at risk. Carter and Emily rallied to Ethan's defense, gathering statements from witnesses and reviewing security footage. The evidence was clear: Ethan had not only saved lives, but had gone out of his way to protect the residents' belongings. The judge called an emergency hearing, the courtroom packed with reporters and supporters. Ethan stood before the judge, his voice steady as he recounted the events of the fire, his humility and honesty shining through. The judge listened, her expression unreadable, then turned to Marcus. "Do you still stand by your accusation?" Marcus hesitated, then shook his head. "No, Your Honor. I was scared. Ethan saved my life." The judge nodded, her voice softening. "Thank you for your honesty. Mr. Hayes, you have completed the conditions of the will. You have shown courage, integrity, and the willingness to change. The inheritance is yours." The courtroom erupted in applause, and Franklin felt a wave of relief and pride wash over him. The final test had been passed, not just in the eyes of the law, but in the hearts of those who mattered most. As the family left the courthouse, the sun shining on a new day, Franklin realized that the greatest legacy was not the money, but the strength to face the past, the courage to change, and the hope that forgiveness could heal even the deepest wounds. The courthouse was still buzzing with excitement as Franklin, Ethan, and Emily stepped out into the sunlight, the weight of the past year finally lifting from their shoulders. Reporters crowded the steps, eager for a statement, but Ethan simply smiled, his arm around his sister, and said, "We're just grateful for a second chance." That night, the family gathered at the farm for a quiet celebration. Carter and Evelyn joined them, their laughter and stories filling the kitchen with warmth. Franklin watched Ethan move through the room, his confidence no longer brittle but genuine, his gratitude shining in every word. After dinner, as the stars blinked to life above the fields, Ethan asked for everyone's attention. He stood at the head of the table, the inheritance papers in his hand, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I spent a long time thinking about what this money means, what Mom wanted, what Dad fought for, what Emily and I lost and found again. I don't want to just inherit a fortune. I want to honor the legacy that built it." He looked at Franklin, his eyes shining. "I'm investing half of it in the community, scholarships, shelters, programs for families like ours. The rest, I want to use to help the farm grow, to make sure it's here for generations. And I want Emily to be my partner. We do this together, as a family." The room was silent for a moment, then erupted in applause and tears. Franklin felt a pride so deep it brought him to his knees. He hugged Ethan and Emily, the pain of the past finally giving way to hope. "Your mother would be so proud," he whispered. "So am I." The next weeks were a whirlwind of planning and new beginnings. Ethan and Emily worked side by side, meeting with community leaders, launching new projects, and welcoming neighbors to the farm. Franklin watched them, his heart full, knowing that the true value of legacy was not in wealth, but in what you choose to do with it. The story of the Hayes family became a beacon for others, a testament to the power of forgiveness, resilience, and the courage to change. As the farm flourished and the community thrived, Franklin realized that the greatest revenge was not in payback, but in living well, loving deeply, and leaving the world better than he'd found it. The decision Ethan made that night changed everything, not just for their family, but for everyone whose lives they touched. And as Franklin sat on the porch, watching the sun rise over the fields, he knew that the journey was far from over, but the future was finally, truly, theirs to shape. The summer sun was high and bright on the day of the Hayes family's first community gathering, the farm transformed into a place of celebration and hope. Franklin stood at the edge of the yard, watching as neighbors, friends, and even a few strangers arrived with baskets of food, folding chairs, and stories to share. The barn was strung with lights, the tables covered in homemade dishes, and the laughter of children echoed across the fields. Ethan and Emily moved through the crowd, greeting guests, introducing the scholarship recipients, and sharing plans for the new community center they were building with the inheritance. Carter and Evelyn arrived with their families, their pride in the Hayes siblings clear in every smile. The mayor gave a short speech, praising the family's resilience and generosity, and presented Franklin with a plaque, for turning pain into purpose, and for showing us all that the greatest legacy is love. As the afternoon wore on, Franklin found himself surrounded by people whose lives had been changed by the family's journey, young men who had found work on the farm, single mothers who had received scholarships, and elderly neighbors who had been welcomed into the Hayes home when they had nowhere else to go. The air was filled with music, the scent of barbecue, and the easy camaraderie of a community that had learned to forgive, to rebuild, and to hope. As the sun began to set, Ethan took the stage, his voice steady as he thanked everyone for their support. "This farm was almost lost to anger and pride," he said. "But we found our way back, because of you, because of family, because of the lessons our parents taught us. We promise to keep building, to keep giving, and to keep this place open to anyone who needs a second chance." The applause was thunderous, and as the music started up again, Franklin and Mark stood together at the edge of the field, the farm stretching out before them, safe and thriving. "We did it, Dad," Ethan said quietly. "We really did." Franklin put an arm around his son's shoulders, his heart overflowing with gratitude. "We did it together, son. And we'll keep doing it, one day at a time." The pain of the past would never fully disappear, but it no longer defined them. Instead, they chose to remember the lessons learned, that dignity is worth fighting for, that forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, and that the truest legacy is not land or money, but the courage to love, forgive, and begin again. As the last guests drifted home and the farm settled into quiet, Franklin looked up at the stars and felt a peace deeper than any he had ever known. The journey had been long and hard, but in the end, it had led them all home. The morning after the gathering, Franklin Hayes woke before dawn, the farmhouse quiet except for the gentle creak of old wood and the distant lowing of cattle. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside, the grass cool beneath his feet, the sky just beginning to blush with the promise of sunrise. The farm stretched out before him, every fence mended, every field alive with the memory of laughter and music from the night before. He walked the familiar paths, his breath clouding in the crisp air, and paused at the edge of the fields, the land stretching out before him, every row a testament to the work he and his children had poured into rebuilding not just the farm, but their family. Ethan joined him, a mug of coffee in hand, his face relaxed and open in a way Franklin hadn't seen since he was a boy. They stood together in silence, father and son, the weight of the past months settling into something softer, no longer a burden, but a bond. "I used to think this place was a curse," Ethan said quietly, his gaze fixed on the fields. "But now I see it's a gift. Thank you for not giving up on me, Dad." Franklin smiled, his heart full. "We both had to learn the hard way, son. But we learned. And that's what matters." As the sun climbed higher, the farm came alive, chickens clucking, the distant rumble of a tractor, the laughter of children as they raced through the rows of corn. Franklin felt a peace settle over him, the kind that comes from knowing you've done the right thing, even when it was the hardest thing. He thought of the pain and forgiveness that had brought them to this moment, and realized that the scars of the past were not something to hide, but to honor. They were proof of survival, of resilience, of the courage to begin again. Ethan turned to him, his eyes shining. "What do we do now?" Franklin looked out over the land, the legacy he'd fought so hard to protect, and felt the answer rise in his chest. We live, son. We love. We keep building, together. As they walked back to the house, the sun warming their backs, Franklin knew that the story of the Hayes farm would be told for generations, not as a tale of betrayal, but as a testament to the power of forgiveness, the strength of family, and the quiet, unbreakable hope that no storm could ever wash away. The journey had been long and hard, but in the end, it had led them home. And as Franklin closed the door behind him, the farm alive with the sounds of a new day, he knew that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together, stronger, wiser, and finally, at peace. Spring arrived with a gentle insistence, the fields of the Hayes farm turning green and gold as Franklin and Ethan prepared for a new tradition, a family gathering to celebrate not just the land, but the journey that had brought them all home. The house was alive with the sounds of laughter and the clatter of dishes as Emily arrived with her children, their joy infectious as they raced through the orchard and helped Mark set up tables beneath the old oak tree. Carter and Evelyn came with pies and stories from town, their friendship now woven into the fabric of the family. Even Lila, the whistleblower whose courage had helped save the farm, brought her husband and a basket of fresh eggs. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of gold and lavender, Franklin stood at the head of a long table set with food and flowers, his heart full as he looked out at the faces of those he loved, Ethan, Emily, the grandchildren, friends old and new. "This farm has seen its share of storms," he began, his voice steady. "But it's also seen the power of forgiveness, the strength of family, and the hope that comes from never giving up. We've learned that legacy isn't just about land or money, it's about the people you love, the lessons you pass on, and the courage to start again, no matter how many times you fall." The family listened in silence, the firelight flickering in their eyes, the pain of old wounds now woven into the fabric of their story. Ethan raised his glass, his voice thick with emotion. "To Dad, for teaching us what it means to fight for what matters. For showing us that dignity is worth more than pride, and that the greatest revenge is living well." The toast was echoed around the table, laughter and tears mingling as the feast began. As the night wore on, Franklin sat back and watched his family, stronger, wiser, and more united than ever. He thought of Brittany's letter, of the forgiveness that had set them free, of the community that had rallied around them, and of the land that would one day belong to Ethan and his children. The pain of the past would never fully disappear, but it no longer defined them. Instead, they chose to remember the lessons learned, that hope is a choice, that love is a gift, and that the truest legacy is the family you build, the lives you touch, and the courage to forgive. As the stars appeared overhead and the world grew quiet, Franklin closed his eyes, grateful for the journey, and ready for whatever tomorrow might bring, knowing that, at last, the Hayes legacy would endure for generations to come.